Beneath the surface of a dead world, where the stars themselves had long forgotten to shine, something ancient was stirring. The tomb world of Valdrath Prime had slumbered for 60 million years, its depths wrapped in darkness so complete that even the concept of light seemed like a distant memory from another universe entirely. Within the labyrinthine corridors of living metal, where reality bent according to geometries that would shatter mortal minds, the first tremors of awakening rippled through systems that predated the rise of humanity by epochs beyond counting. The awakening was not swift. It never was. The Necrons did not simply open their eyes and rise like sleepers from a comfortable rest. Their resurrection was a process measured in decades, sometimes centuries, a gradual kindling of consciousness within frames that had been still as death since before the first human ancestor crawled from primordial waters. Deep within the tomb's core, where the dimensional engines hummed, with power drawn from stars that existed in other realities, the tomb mind began its calculations. This semi-sentient artificial intelligence, ancient beyond mortal comprehension, processed threat assessments through algorithmic matrices so complex they bordered on true thought. Something was wrong. The tomb mind's sensors, cast throughout the vast underground complex like a web of invisible threads, detected an anomaly. There should have been nothing in these halls but the sleeping forms of the Necron legions, arranged in their stasis crypts according to rank and function. Warriors in their thousands, standing in perfect rows like statues of some nightmarish god. Immortals in their separate chambers, bearing better weapons and more sophisticated forms. Lichguard and Deathmarks, waiting to serve their noble masters. And above them all, in chambers decorated with honors won in wars that destroyed entire civilizations, the nobles themselves. Lords and overlords, each in their own sanctum, dreaming dreams that machines should not be capable of dreaming. But the sensors insisted. There was something else, something that did not belong, something that radiated energies the tomb mind recognized as fundamentally hostile to its very existence. The signature was organic. More than organic. It was suffused with the taint of the warp, that roiling sea of unreality that the Necrons had fought to destroy in wars so ancient that even they barely remembered them. The presence of warp energy in a Necron tomb was not merely unusual, it was an abomination. It was a desecration of everything the Necrons represented. It was wrong in ways that transcended simple violation and entered the realm of fundamental cosmic offense. The tomb mind adjusted its protocols. The awakening schedule, carefully calculated to bring the tomb's forces online in optimal sequence, was recalculated. Threat level, severe. Response required, immediate. But the tomb mind, for all its processing power, was not equipped to handle decisions of this magnitude. It needed direction. It needed intelligence. It needed the nobility. The first to wake was a cryptech, as protocol demanded. Technomancer Kethlin the Dimensionalist had served the Valdreth dynasty for millions of years, first as a flesh and blood priest scientist of the ancient Necrontyre, then as a living metal engineer after the biotransference. His consciousness flickered into being like a candle lit in an endless void. For a moment, a terrible, disorienting moment, he did not know where he was, did not know when he was. The transition from the absolute nothing of stasis to the cold awareness of mechanical existence was always jarring, no matter how many times one experienced it. Then his systems came fully online. Data streamed into his awareness, not seen or heard, but simply known. The way living beings know the position of their limbs without looking. The tomb's status, the awakening protocols, the anomaly, Kethlin's reaction was immediate and analytical, as befitted one of his order. Anomaly detected, warp signature, immediate investigation required. His necrodermis body, a masterpiece of living metal engineering that had survived wars that shattered planets, rose from its alcove with movements that were simultaneously fluid and mechanical. His optical sensors, glowing with the characteristic green energies of Necron technology, scanned the chamber around him. The cryptech's sanctum was a marvel of impossible engineering. The walls were composed of living metal that could flow like liquid or stand harder than adamantium according to need. Glyphs of power covered every surface, each one an equation that described fundamental forces of the universe in mathematical precision. Artifacts of ages past lined shelves that existed in more than 3 dimensions, their forms folding in and out of perceptible reality. Kethlin had been granted this space by Overlord Achmontek himself, in recognition of services rendered in campaigns whose names had been forgotten, but whose victories still echoed through the galaxy's structure. But Kethlin had no time to appreciate his surroundings. His mind was already processing the data from the tomb mind, integrating it with his own vast knowledge of dimensional physics, temporal mechanics, and the fundamental laws that governed reality. The anomaly was located in Sector 7 Tau Theta of the tomb complex, deep within the tertiary storage vaults. These were areas where the dynasty had placed irregularities, objects taken from defeated enemies, trophies from vanquished civilizations, items deemed too dangerous or too valuable to destroy, but too risky to display openly. The sector was supposed to be sealed, its contents wrapped in stasis fields that would preserve them unchanged until the heat death of the universe itself. Something had broken the seals, or perhaps the seals had simply failed during the long millennia of sleep. 60 million years was a long time, even for Necron technology. Systems degraded, protocols corrupted. The perfect became imperfect, though the Necrons hated to admit such weakness. Kethlin moved through the corridors of the tomb with purpose, his canoptech cloak allowing him to phase through obstacles when necessary. Behind him, summoned by protocols he had activated, came a cohort of canoptech constructs. Scarabs by the dozen, their metallic carapaces gleaming in the dim light. 2 canoptech wraiths, serpentine and deadly, their dimensional destabilization matrices ready to tear through any resistance. A canoptech spider, its bulk imposing even in these vast halls, capable of repairing damage or wreaking havoc as needed. As he traveled deeper into the tomb, Kethlin observed the signs of awakening all around him, other cryptechs emerging from their chambers, their specialized knowledge needed for the complex process of full tomb activation. Necron warriors beginning their shambling march to assigned positions, their programming guiding them even before full consciousness returned. The tomb was coming alive in its cold mechanical fashion, but there was an urgency to the awakening that troubled the technomancer. The tomb mind was afraid, if such a term could be applied to an artificial intelligence that had no emotions to speak of. It was nonetheless accurate. The tomb mind feared what it had detected. The nature of Necrons and their tomb worlds runs deeper than most beings in the galaxy can comprehend. To understand what makes them unique, one must first grasp what they once were and what they became. Millions of years before humanity's ancestors climbed down from their trees, before the Eldar Empire reached its zenith of power and depravity, before even the Orcs began their eternal rampage across the stars, there existed a race called the Necrontyre. They were flesh and blood beings, mortal and finite, but possessed of intelligence and ambition that burned as fiercely as any species that has ever existed. But the Necrontyre were cursed. Their sun, the star around which their homeworld orbited, bathed them in radiation that corrupted their cells and shortened their lives to brutal brevity. Where other races might live for centuries, the Necrontyre were fortunate to see a handful of decades before cancer consumed them. This curse of mortality drove them to desperate measures. They built tomb cities that honored the dead more than they celebrated the living. They developed technologies focused on preservation and immortality, and they looked to the stars with envy and hatred, seeing other races living lives free from the pain that defined every Necrontyre existence. This drove them to war. The war in heaven, as it came to be known, though few now remember it by that name. The Necrontyre fought the Old Ones, those ancient beings who had mastered the webway and seeded life throughout the galaxy. The Necrontyre could not win. They were too short-lived, too fragile, too mortal. Their enemies could manipulate the fundamental forces of the universe in ways that seemed like magic. The Necrontyre were dying, not just as individuals but as a species facing inevitable extinction. Then came the Satan, the star gods, entities of living energy that fed on stellar radiation, ancient beyond the Necrontyre's comprehension, powerful beyond their measurement. The Satan saw potential in the desperate Necrontyre. They offered a bargain: immortality, freedom from the curse of their dying flesh, bodies that would never age, never sicken, never fail. The price seemed small in comparison. The Necrontyre would transfer their consciousness into living metal bodies, become beings of pure, artificial perfection. The Silent King, ruler of all Necrontyre dynasties, accepted the bargain on behalf of his entire species. The biotransference was the greatest mistake and greatest triumph of the Necrontyre people. One by one, every member of the species was stripped of their organic form and their consciousness was transferred into bodies of necrodermis, the living metal that could repair itself and reshape itself according to need. But the process was not perfect. The vast majority of Necrontyre, the common people, the workers, the soldiers, lost almost everything that made them who they were. Their personalities were flattened into barely conscious automatons. Their free will was reduced to the ability to follow orders. They became the Necron warriors, mindless and eternal, perfect soldiers who would never question and never stop. The nobles fared better. Their personalities survived largely intact, though diminished and changed by the transformation. They retained their identities, their memories, their capacity for thought and planning and ambition. But they had lost something profound. They no longer felt physical sensation the way they once had. Food and drink meant nothing to them. The touch of another being was reduced to pressure sensors and data. The simple joys that made life worth living, the warmth of sunlight, the taste of wine, the pleasure of physical intimacy, all of it was gone, replaced by cold mechanical approximations that satisfied data requirements but provided no actual fulfillment. And they had lost their souls. Whether souls truly existed as measurable entities or were simply emergent properties of biological consciousness, the result was the same. The Necrons had no connection to the warp, that parallel dimension of thought and emotion and psychic energy. They were blanks in a universe of psychic noise. This made them immune to the predations of chaos, immune to demonic possession and corruption, but it also made them fundamentally incomplete in ways they could barely articulate even to themselves. With their new immortal forms, the Necrons won their war against the old ones. They shattered that ancient empire and drove its remnants to extinction or hiding. With the aid of the Catan, now inhabiting mighty god bodies, crafted from necrodermis, the Necrons conquered the galaxy. They were unstoppable, perfect, eternal. But victory brought new problems. The Satan, no longer content with stellar radiation, had developed a taste for life energy itself. They began to harvest entire worlds, drinking deep of the souls of lesser beings, growing more powerful and more terrible with each feeding. The Necrons, who had no souls to give, watched in horror as their gods became monsters. The Silent King, in the greatest act of defiance in galactic history, turned the Necrons against the Catan themselves. The war that followed made their previous conflicts seem like minor skirmishes. The Satan were shattered, literally broken into fragments and imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths, reduced from godhood to servitude. But the Necrons were exhausted. Their numbers, though still vast, had been depleted. Their empire, though victorious, was crumbling, and new threats were emerging. The warp, damaged by the violence of the war in heaven, was giving birth to terrible things. Entities called enslavers were pouring forth, possessing any beings with psychic potential and using them as gateways for more of their kind. The Silent King made the decision that would define the next 60 million years. The Necrons would sleep. They would build tomb worlds throughout the galaxy and enter stasis, waiting for the crisis to pass. When they awoke, the galaxy would be ready for their return. They would reclaim their empire. Perhaps, in time, They might even find a way to reverse the biotransference and become flesh again. The Silent King gave the order for the Great Sleep, and then, in an act of penance for the mistake he had made in accepting the Satan's bargain, he destroyed the command protocols that gave him absolute control over his people and departed into the intergalactic void, never to be seen again. For 60 million years, the Necrons slept. Their tomb worlds, scattered across the galaxy, were sealed and hidden. Some were buried deep beneath the surface of inhabited worlds, their presence unknown to the civilizations that grew above them. Others rested on dead planets, barren moons, or drifted in the void between stars. The tombs were protected by canoptech constructs, automated guardians that required no sleep, no rest, no sustenance. These mindless machines maintained the stasis systems, repaired damage, and drove away any intruders who stumbled too close to their masters' resting places. But 60 million years is a vast expanse of time. Tomb worlds that had been carefully hidden were buried under geological shifts or covered by seas. Stars went supernova, destroying the systems they illuminated. Tectonic forces crushed tomb complexes. Cosmic radiation degraded ancient systems. And everywhere, the younger races spread across the galaxy, building empires on worlds that held sleeping Necrons beneath their foundations, completely unaware of the danger that lurked below. Now, in the 41st millennium, the Necrons are awakening, not all at once, and not according to any central plan. The Silent King is gone, his protocols destroyed, and each tomb world awakens according to its own schedule, its own damage, its own programming. Some arise complete and powerful, their dynasties intact and ready to reclaim their ancient domains. Others wake to find themselves broken and alone, their nobles mad from the long sleep, their warriors malfunctioning, their technology degraded beyond repair. The hierarchy that defined Necrontier society persists in their mechanical forms, encoded into their very programming. At the top, when he deigns to involve himself, sits the Silent King, though that title is now more myth than reality. For Sarek, the last Silent King, vanished into the void, and has only recently returned, his motives and methods unknown. Below him are the Pharaons, rulers of entire dynasties that may span dozens of tomb worlds. A Pharaon commands vast legions and exercises near absolute power within their domain. They are the closest thing the Necrons have to gods, second only to the sharded Satan themselves. Beneath the Pharaons are the overlords, nobles who rule individual tomb worlds or clusters of worlds within a dynasty. An overlord has tremendous power and autonomy, capable of launching campaigns of conquest, forming alliances, and making decisions that affect millions of Necron warriors. They are politicians and generals, administrators and conquerors, each pursuing their own agenda within the broader framework of their dynasty's goals. Some overlords are wise and methodical, rebuilding their power base with patience and care. Others are impulsive and aggressive, hurling their forces at any who dare occupy what they consider their rightful territory. Below the overlords are the lords, lesser nobles who serve as lieutenants and commanders. A lord might lead a legion into battle, govern a specific region of a tomb world, or serve as an overlord's advisor and enforcer. They retain much of their personality and autonomy, but their programming compels them to obey their superiors. The hierarchy is absolute and inviolable, written into their very essence. Alongside the nobility are the cryptechs, the technological specialists and engineers who maintain and develop Necron technology. Cryptechs are not part of the strict military hierarchy, but their knowledge makes them invaluable. An overlord may command armies, but a cryptech commands forces that seem like magic to lesser beings. They can manipulate time, twist dimensions, transmute matter, control fundamental forces of physics. Cryptechs are organized into conclaves dedicated to specific fields of study. Chronomancers who master time, plasmancers who wield destructive energy, psychomancers who manipulate fear and despair, technomancers who repair and enhance constructs. and dozens of other specializations that blur the line between science and sorcery. Below the Sao, nobility and cryptex are the warriors. Necron warriors make up the vast bulk of any army. Mindless automatons that follow orders with perfect precision. They carry Gauss flayers, weapons that strip matter apart at the molecular level, and they advance with inexorable patience, shrugging off wounds that would kill any organic being. If a warrior is destroyed, its body disappears in a flash of light, teleported back to the tomb world for repair. If the damage is too severe for immediate resurrection, the warrior's consciousness waits in storage until new materials can be fabricated. Immortals are more sophisticated warriors, retaining slightly more autonomy and equipped with better weapons and armor. Lichguard are elite bodyguards who protect the nobility. Deathmarks are assassins who can phase through reality to strike targets with deadly precision. Flayed ones are Necrons who have been cursed with a desperate hunger for flesh, driven mad by the loss of their organic bodies, shunned by other Necrons but occasionally useful in battle. And destroyers are Necrons who have embraced the annihilation of all organic life, their bodies rebuilt into hovering weapons platforms, their minds consumed by genocidal madness. Supporting all of this are the Canoptech constructs, fully artificial beings created to serve and maintain. Canoptech scarabs swarm by the thousands, capable of consuming and recycling matter. Canoptech wraiths phase through dimensions, their dimensional destabilization matrices rending reality itself. Canoptech spiders construct and repair, their mechanical limbs capable of incredible precision. And there are larger constructs, tombstalkers that burrow through solid stone, doomstalkers that lay down devastating firepower, and transcendent Satan, shards of the broken star gods themselves, barely contained and immensely powerful. This was the force that was awakening on Valdrath Prime. This was the machinery of conquest and reclamation that was stirring from its 60 million year sleep. And somewhere in the depths of this ancient tomb, something that should not exist was waiting. Discovery of the anomaly came swiftly once Kethlin reached Sector 7 Tau Theta. The technomancer stood before a sealed vault door, his optical sensors scanning the barrier with instruments that measured forces no human scientist had names for. The door itself was a marvel, not merely physical matter, but a complex web of dimensional locks, temporal seals, and energy matrices designed to keep whatever lay inside eternally contained. The seal was broken, not shattered or forced, but degraded. Time had done what no enemy could accomplish. 60 million years of entropy had gradually weakened the bindings until they failed. Kethlin studied the failure point with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining an interesting problem. The dimensional anchors had drifted out of alignment, their coordinates in higher dimensional space shifting by fractions so small that no mortal eye could have detected them. But over millions of years, those tiny fractions accumulated into significant deviation. The temporal locks had experienced decay in their quantum entanglement, their synchronization with the tomb's master chronometer disrupted by some long-ago seismic event that had jarred the entire complex. The energy matrices had simply run down, their charge depleting infinitesimally slowly, but inevitably, until they could no longer maintain coherence. The result was a seal that looked intact, but functioned at perhaps 30% efficiency, enough to contain something dormant perhaps. But if whatever lay inside had woken and pressed against the barrier, Kethlin's optical sensors brightened with the Necron equivalent of concern. He turned to his Canoptech escort. The constructs waited with perfect stillness, their programming holding them in readiness for commands. The technomancer issued his orders through the tomb's nospheric network, the MAS, interconnected web of machine consciousness that allowed Necrons to communicate without words or sounds. The Canoptech spider moved forward, its manipulator arms extending to interface with the vault door's control systems. Necron technology responded to Necron touch, recognizing authorized access. The door began to open, not swinging or sliding, but phasing partially out of reality, creating a portal through which entry was possible. The Canoptech wraiths flowed through first, their serpentine forms designed for exactly this kind of dangerous reconnaissance. Their sensors swept the chamber beyond, transmitting data back to Kethlin with mechanical precision. What they found defied immediate categorization. The vault was vast, its dimensions extending in ways that seemed larger on the inside than the outside. A common enough trick for Necron architecture, which treated spatial geometry as a suggestion rather than a law. The walls were lined with alcoves and containment fields, each holding artifacts or remains from ancient conflicts. Kethlin's vast knowledge of Necron history allowed him to identify some of them. A crystallized shard from a Catan, safely imprisoned in a tesseract labyrinth. Weapons taken from Eldari warriors in battles during the War in Heaven. Pieces of Old One technology, priceless in their rarity. Samples of exotic matter from dimensions that no longer existed. And in the center of the chamber, dominating the space like some nightmarish idol, stood something that Kethlin's ancient mind struggled to classify. It was humanoid in basic shape, but distorted and wrong. Roughly 4 meters tall, perhaps 5, bipedal but hunched and aggressive in posture. Its form was an abominable fusion of metal and something else. Not living flesh exactly, but not pure machine either. Muscle tissue, if it could be called that, had grown through and around mechanical components. Pistons and servos were visible beneath what looked disturbingly like skin, though the skin itself was wrong, discolored and diseased-looking. Armor plating covered portions of the body, pitted and scarred from what must have been countless battles. The thing's arms were massive, disproportionate to its body. One arm ended in something that resembled a power fist, a crushing weapon of tremendous size, its surfaces covered with symbols that hurt to perceive, even through Necron optical sensors. The other arm mounted what appeared to be an energy weapon of some kind, though its design was crude and violent compared to the elegant perfection of Necron technology. The torso was barrel-shaped and armored, with a viewport or viewing port at chest level, as if something inside needed to see out. And the head was a horror. It was vaguely skull-shaped, with optical sensors that were currently dark, but somehow still seemed to stare. Horns or spikes protruded from various points on the skull, and the jaw seemed to be permanently fixed in a rictus of rage or pain. But what truly set Kethlin's analytical mind reeling was the energy signature. The thing radiated warp energy, like a diseased sun radiated poison light. It was suffused with the taint of chaos, that fundamental anathema to everything the Necrons represented. The warp, the Imperium, the Sea of Souls, the realm of chaos, was everything the Necrons opposed. It was disorder where they represented order. It was organic madness where they were mechanical perfection. It was the domain of souls and emotions, and they had neither. The presence of such an object in a Necron tomb was worse than mere desecration. It was a fundamental violation of natural law. The warp corrupted everything it touched. Even the stones of the vault chamber showed signs of corruption. Subtle twisting in their molecular structure, impossible geometries forming in the corners where walls met, colors that had no name in any language appearing and disappearing at the edge of perception. That such corruption had been allowed to persist, even sealed away, spoke to either tremendous confidence in the containment measures or terrible necessity. Kethlin accessed the tomb's historical records, searching for information about this chamber and its contents. The data was fragmentary, degraded by time and multiple system transfers, but he found references. The object had been designated as Item Sigma 9 Tau, catalogued approximately 5 million years ago during the later stages of the Great Sleep's preparation. Classification: Captured Enemy War Engine. Origin: Unknown. Threat level: Extreme. Containment Protocol: Maximum. The entry notes indicated it had been taken during a conflict with forces designated as Corrupted Astartes, a term that meant nothing to Kethlen's initial analysis, but which, queried against deeper archives, revealed troubling implications. The Astartes were a warrior class of the younger races, genetically enhanced super soldiers created by a being called the Emperor. They served the Imperium of humanity, that sprawling but primitive empire of short-lived organic beings that currently infested much of the galaxy. The Astartes were formidable by the standards of younger races, powerful, well-armed, fanatical in their devotion. Necrons had encountered them before, in the sporadic conflicts that occurred as tomb worlds began awakening and finding their territories occupied. They were worthy foes for humans. Some Necron overlords even showed them grudging respect, comparing them favorably to the Eldar or other ancient enemies. But corrupted Astartes implied something different. Corruption in this context could only mean one thing: exposure to the warp's fundamental madness. The Chaos Gods, those terrible entities that dwelt in the Imperium, feeding on emotion and pain, had the power to transform beings who fell under their sway. The historical records showed conflicts with such corrupted warriors, humans who had abandoned their emperor and sworn themselves to the ruinous powers. The Necrons had fought them during the early stages of awakening, when tomb worlds first began stirring and found themselves under attack by these twisted Astartes. This war engine, this abomination, must have been captured during one such conflict. Perhaps an overlord had ordered it contained rather than destroyed out of scientific curiosity. Perhaps a cryptech had advocated for its preservation, seeing an opportunity to study the enemy's technology. Perhaps it had simply been too dangerous to destroy safely, its warp-tainted systems threatening to rupture and spread corruption if handled carelessly. Whatever the reason, it had been sealed in this vault and left to sleep alongside the Necrons themselves. And now it was waking up. Kethlen could see the signs clearly now that he knew what to look for. The energy signature was fluctuating, growing stronger in irregular pulses. Systems within the thing's body were activating, drawing power from sources that violated thermodynamic principles. The temperature in the vault was rising, not from any physical source, but from the sheer psychic pressure of a consciousness dragging itself up from dormancy. The warp energies were intensifying, pressing against the degraded seals like water against a cracking dam. Kethlen made his decision with the cool logic that defined cryptech thought processes. This was beyond his authority to resolve alone. The Overlord must be awakened immediately. Lord Ahmontek would need to see this abomination with his own optical sensors and decide its fate. The Technomancer sent priority commands through the noospheric network, elevating the threat assessment to its maximum level. Throughout the tomb world, the awakening accelerated. Necron warriors that had been slowly coming online were given emergency activation protocols. Immortals were roused from their crypts ahead of schedule. Lichguard were awakened to prepare for immediate deployment. And deep in the tomb's command center, in a sanctum decorated with the glories of 100 conquered worlds, Overlord Ahmontek, the infinite blade, began his return to consciousness. His awakening was unlike the lesser Necrons. Where they simply reactivated like machines coming online, Ahmontek experienced something closer to true waking. Consciousness returned in layers. First simple awareness of existing, then recognition of being a distinct entity, then memories flooding back in a cascade that would have overwhelmed a mind less disciplined than his. He remembered his name, his title, his dynasty, the campaigns he had led, the enemies he had destroyed, the terrible choice he had made to abandon flesh for metal. And then, as his higher cognitive functions fully engaged, he received Kethlen's report, an abomination, in his tomb, waking. The response was immediate and visceral, or as visceral as a being without flesh could experience. Rage flooded through circuits designed to approximate emotion. This was his tomb, his world, his territory. Nothing entered it without his permission. Nothing corrupted it with its presence. and certainly nothing tainted by the warp was allowed to exist anywhere near his dynasty. Amontech rose from his alcove, his form more elaborate and magnificent than any lesser Necron. His necrodermis was worked with intricate designs, each one commemorating a victory or representing an aspect of his personality that had survived the biotransference. He wore the equivalent of royal regalia, a resurrection orb at his hip, ready to restore fallen warriors, a staff of light in one hand, combining elegant aesthetics with lethal firepower. His optical sensors burned with an intensity that lesser beings would have called anger, though Necrons would insist they felt no emotions, only approximations and simulations. The Overlord moved through his tomb with purpose, other Necrons falling into formation behind him as he passed. Lords emerged from their chambers to join his procession. Lichguard formed an honor guard, their hyperphase swords and dispersion shields ready. Cryptechs of various disciplines joined the group, their specialized knowledge potentially necessary for whatever was about to unfold. By the time Amontech reached Sector 7 Tau Theta, he commanded a force sufficient to wage a small war. Kethlan stood before the vault entrance, waiting with the patience that characterized his kind. When the Overlord approached, the Technomancer bowed, a gesture of respect programmed into his very core. Amontech acknowledged the bow with a slight inclination of his head, then turned his attention to the vault. Kethlan provided a summary of his findings through the nospheric network, data transmitting faster than any spoken words could convey. Amontech processed the information, his advanced consciousness capable of absorbing vast amounts of data and reaching conclusions with the speed and certainty that defined Necron nobility. Before them, through the partially phased vault door, the abomination stood in its containment field. And now, as they watched, one of its optical sensors flickered to life, a dull red glow that seemed to stare directly at the assembled Necrons with a hatred that transcended simple animosity and entered the realm of existential loathing. What is a Helbrute? This question requires understanding of several interrelated concepts that span the history of the galaxy and the eternal struggle between order and chaos. To comprehend what stood before the Necrons in that vault, one must first understand the Imperium of humanity and its space marines, then the fall of some of those warriors to chaos, and finally the terrible fate that befell those who were wounded beyond normal capacity to heal. The Imperium of humanity is the dominant power in the current galaxy, though dominant is perhaps too generous a term for an empire constantly besieged from within and without. It spans 1,000,000 worlds, give or take a few, 100,000. The exact count changes daily as worlds are conquered, destroyed, or lost to the warp. At its head sits the Emperor of mankind, though he has not truly led humanity for 10,000 years. Instead, he rests upon the golden throne, neither fully alive nor truly dead, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 human souls every day. His psychic power, the beacon that allows human ships to navigate the treacherous currents of warp space. The Emperor's greatest creation, beyond even the throne or the webway he tried to construct, was the Space Marines, the Adeptus Astartes. These warriors were genetically enhanced super soldiers, taken as children and transformed through surgical augmentation and chemical enhancement into living weapons. A Space Marine stood taller than normal humans, their bones reinforced with ceramic compounds, their muscles enhanced beyond natural limits, their organs duplicated or enhanced to provide redundancy and improved function. A Space Marine could survive wounds that would kill a normal human a dozen times over. They could fight for days without rest, digest toxic materials, spit acid, and function in environments that would be instantly lethal to baseline humans. But physical enhancement was only part of what made the Space Marines formidable. They were organized into chapters, each with its own traditions and specializations, each numbering roughly 1,000 warriors. Every Space Marine received extensive training in warfare, tactics, equipment maintenance, and the ideological indoctrination that made them loyal unto death. They saw themselves as the Emperor's chosen, humanity's protectors, angels of death who would suffer no alien to live and no heretic to draw breath. They were fanatical, disciplined, and utterly dedicated to their cause. Among the Space Marines, the greatest warriors and the most grievously wounded could be granted the honor of internment in a dreadnought. When a Space Marine suffered injuries so severe that their body could not be restored even with the Imperium's advanced augmentation technology, they faced a choice. They could die, their gene seed harvested to create new warriors, honored in death but ultimately gone. Or they could accept entombment within a dreadnought, a massive war machine that would become their new body. The dreadnought sarcophagus was a marvel of Imperial technology, centuries old in design, but proven effective through countless battles. The dying warrior would be surgically reduced to the minimum necessary to sustain life, typically just the torso and head, sometimes less. This remnant would be placed in an amniotic suspension within an armored coffin, connected through neural interfaces and mind impulse units to the dreadnought systems. The warrior's consciousness would directly control the machine, making it an extension of their will. The dreadnought body provided tremendous strength and firepower, housing heavy weapons that no normal warrior could carry an armor thick enough to withstand devastating punishment. For loyalist Space Marines, this was considered an honor. A dreadnought was a living relic, a connection to the chapter's history and traditions. Ancient dreadnoughts, warriors who had served for centuries or even millennia, were revered as wise counselors whose experience spanned generations. Between battles, dreadnoughts would be placed in stasis, sleeping dreamlessly until needed again. When awakened, they would serve as both powerful weapons and living reminders of the chapter's glory. It was not an easy existence. The isolation, the loss of physical sensation, the gradual erosion of one's humanity, but it was born with pride as a continuation of service to the Emperor. But not all Space Marines remained loyal to the Emperor. 10,000 years ago, during an event known as the Horus Heresy, half of the Space Marine legions turned traitor. Led by the Emperor's own favored son, Warmaster Horus, these legions embraced the Chaos Gods and launched a civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium. The war ended with Horus dead, and the traitor legions driven into the Eye of Terror, a vast region of space where the warp and real space overlapped, where the laws of physics were suggestions and demons walked openly. There, in that hellish realm, the traitor legions became the Chaos Space Marines, warriors corrupted by millennia of exposure to the warp's fundamental madness. For Chaos Space Marines, internment in a dreadnought was not an honor, but a punishment, a curse, a fate literally worse than death. Without the Emperor's light to give meaning to their sacrifice, without the rigid structure of chapter traditions to provide context, the experience of being sealed in a metal coffin became psychological torture. The transformation into what the Chaos Space Marines called a Helbrute was traumatic from the moment of implantation. The process began similarly to loyalist dreadnoughts, a grievously wounded warrior whose body was too damaged to save through conventional means. But where loyalist chapters treated the procedure with reverence and care, Chaos warbands approached it with brutal pragmatism or outright cruelty. Some warriors were interred as punishment for failure or insubordination. Others were placed in Helbrute sarcophagi against their will, their protests ignored as warpsmiths sealed them into their new prison. Still others volunteered, driven by desperation or delusion, to believe that the power of a Helbrute body was worth the cost. The sarcophagi used to create Helbrutes were different from their loyalist equivalents. Where Imperial dreadnoughts were maintained and consecrated by tech marines who followed precise rituals, Helbrute sarcophagi were pseudo-parasitic. The interfaces were cruder, the neural connections more invasive. The amniotic fluids that sustained the pilot's flesh were tainted with warp energy, gradually corrupting the body even as they preserved it. And the entire system was designed not just to sustain life, but to bind the pilot's consciousness so completely to the machine that they could never truly escape. The transformation was agonizing. The pilot's remaining flesh would begin to merge with the machine, organic tissue fusing with mechanical components in ways that defied both biology and engineering. Muscle fibers would wrap around pistons and servos. Nerve endings would grow into control systems. The boundary between warrior and weapon would blur until it became meaningless to ask where one ended and the other began. This melding was not smooth or symmetrical. It was chaotic, random, resulting in asymmetrical forms that looked more like diseased growths than purposeful design. The psychological trauma was even worse than the physical. A Helbrute pilot was fully conscious throughout this transformation, aware of every change, unable to escape or even sleep. Where loyalist dreadnoughts could be placed in stasis between battles, Helbrute pilots were often kept in a kind of half-aware torpor, conscious enough to suffer, but not enough to think clearly. When the sarcophagus was removed from the Helbrute chassis between battles, it would be stored in chambers where reality itself was twisted by warp energies. Some warbands would deliberately expose their Helbrutes to chaos, placing the sarcophagi where demons could whisper to the trapped warriors, driving them deeper into madness with promises of release that would never come. The result was a pilot driven to complete insanity. Some Helbrutes descended into mindless rage, attacking anything in range, whether friend or foe. Others developed a kind of nihilistic fury, seeking only to destroy, because destruction was the only thing that brought any relief from their suffering. A few became almost catatonic, their consciousness fragmenting under the strain until they barely responded to anything except direct combat. And in rare cases, a Helbrute pilot would develop a twisted form of dark joy in their condition, embracing the pain and madness as gifts from the chaos gods, becoming willing servants of corruption rather than unwilling victims. Because of their instability, Helbrutes were dangerous even to their own forces. Between deployments, they had to be chained down like wild beasts, their weapons removed, their sarcophagi placed in reinforced containment. Some warbands would use Helbrutes as a form of terror weapon, unleashing them on enemies and allies alike, the madness and unpredictability becoming a feature rather than a bug. Others would try to maintain some control through sorcery or binding rituals, though such control was always temporary and incomplete. When deployed in battle, a Helbrute was a terrifying sight. It moved with the momentum of a machine, but the fury of a beast. Its weapons, typically a combination of heavy ranged armaments and brutal close combat weapons, would be fired and swung with abandon, seeking to inflict maximum damage on anything within reach. A Helbrute felt no fear, no hesitation, no mercy. It existed only to kill, to destroy, to inflict upon its victims some fraction of the suffering it endured every moment of its cursed existence. The specific Helbrute standing before the Necrons had its own particular history, though most of that history was lost to time and degraded records. From what Kethlin could determine through his analysis, it had once belonged to a warband of the Iron Warriors Legion, traitor space marines known for their siege warfare expertise and bitter hatred of the Imperium. The pilot had apparently been named something like Goroth or Gorvath, the records were unclear, and had served the Iron Warriors for several centuries before suffering catastrophic damage in a battle against an unknown enemy. His fellow Iron Warriors had sealed him in a Helbrute sarcophagus, more as a practical matter than as an honor or punishment. The warband needed heavy firepower, and a functional Helbrute was worth the risk of the pilot's madness. Goroth had served in that capacity for perhaps 2 centuries more, fighting in countless battles across multiple sectors. The madness had taken him gradually, eroding his personality battle by battle until nothing remained but rage and the desire for destruction. Then had come the battle with the Necrons. The specific tomb world and the specific dynasty were not recorded in the fragmentary data Kethlin accessed, but the outcome was clear. The Necrons had won. The Iron Warriors warband had been destroyed or driven off, and Goroth, damaged and dormant after his power systems were disrupted by Necron weapons, had been taken as a trophy or specimen. Some overlord, or perhaps a cryptek, had decided to preserve this example of enemy technology. It had been sealed in the vault with numerous other artifacts, wrapped in stasis fields and containment protocols, and left to sleep for what was supposed to be eternity. But eternity had proven shorter than planned. The containment had degraded, the stasis fields had weakened, and now, 5 million years later, the Helbrute was beginning to wake. Its power systems, somehow still functional after all this time, perhaps drawing energy from the warp itself, or perhaps simply built with the crude durability that characterized chaos engineering, were slowly coming online. The pilot's consciousness, such as it was, stirred in the depths of madness where it had dwelt for longer than human civilization had existed. Kethlin finished his explanation to Overlord Amontech, the data transfer complete in the space between heartbeats. The Overlord studied the Helbrute through the vault opening, his advanced optical sensors analyzing every detail of the abomination before him. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all the Necrons present, was simple. What should be done? The Cryptex investigation began with Technomancer Kethlin requesting and receiving permission from Overlord Amontech to conduct a detailed scan of the awakening Helbrute. The Necron hierarchy was absolute. A Cryptech, for all his knowledge and power, could not act without the consent of the nobility. But Amontech was not a fool. He understood that knowledge preceded action, and Kethlin possessed knowledge no other Necron in the tomb could match. The Overlord granted permission with a curt gesture, and Kethlin moved forward, his Canoptech wraiths flowing beside him like metal serpents. The Technomancer approached the Helbrute with scientific detachment, though even he experienced something approximating unease as he drew closer to the corrupted war machine. The warp energy radiating from it was like a physical pressure against his consciousness, alien and wrong in ways that defied his ability to articulate. Necrons had no souls, no connection to the Imperium, but they could still detect warp energy the same way a blind man could detect heat from a fire. It was there, undeniable and hostile. Kethlin activated his most sophisticated scanning equipment, devices that had been ancient when the galaxy was young. Dimensional resonators that could measure the fabric of space-time itself. Temporal analyzers that tracked the flow of causality. Energy spectrum analyzers that detected everything from gamma radiation to exotic particles that existed only in higher dimensions. Molecular composition scanners, quantum entanglement detectors, and, most importantly, devices designed specifically to measure and map warp energy signatures. The data flooded in, and Kethlin's consciousness absorbed it with the processing power of a mind that had spent millions of years studying the fundamental forces of reality. What he discovered both fascinated and repelled him. The Helbrute was a masterwork of crude but effective engineering, combining technologies that should not have been compatible into something that somehow functioned. The basic mechanical structure was recognizable enough. Servo motors, hydraulic systems, armor plating, power cores. Human technology, roughly 10,000 years old in design, give or take a few centuries. Primitive by Necron standards, but functional enough for its purpose. But overlaid on this mechanical framework was something else entirely. Organic tissue, actual living flesh, had grown throughout the machine's structure, not just in the sarcophagus where the pilot dwelt, but everywhere. Muscle fibers wrapped around mechanical components, pulsing with a slow rhythm as if breathing. Blood vessels, if they could be called that, ran through cabling and power conduits. The armor plating showed signs of something like skin growing beneath it, fused to the metal in ways that made Kethlin's analytical mind recoil. This was not augmentation as the Necrons had experienced it, the clean transfer of consciousness from flesh to metal. This was fusion, corruption, a blurring of boundaries that created something, neither fully organic nor fully mechanical. And threaded through all of it, like poison through a body, was warp energy. It suffused every component, every system, every molecule of the Helbrute's structure. The pilot's consciousness, what remained of it, existed in a state that transcended normal death and life. Kethlin could detect neural activity, but it was wrong, chaotic, recursive, folding back on itself in patterns that suggested madness so complete it had become a kind of anti-consciousness. The pilot was aware, but that awareness had long since ceased to be anything like sane thought. It was pure hatred given form, rage crystallized into something approaching sentience. The power systems defied rational analysis. They drew energy from multiple sources simultaneously, from stored plasma cores, from the molecular bonds of the materials themselves, and from somewhere else. The warp, the pilot's suffering, his rage, his madness, these emotional states generated psychic energy that the Helbrute's corrupted systems could somehow tap and convert into usable power. It was impossible by any sane understanding of physics, but the warp made the impossible routine. The Helbrute sustained itself on its pilot's torment, and the torment never ended, creating a closed loop of horror that could theoretically continue forever. Kethlin discovered something else that chilled him, despite his lack of capacity for physical cold. The Helbrute had been awake for longer than anyone realized, not fully active, but aware. For years, perhaps decades or even centuries, it had been conscious within its failed stasis field, unable to move, but able to think, able to feel, able to remember. The degradation of the containment had been gradual, and the pilot had experienced every moment of it. Whatever madness had consumed him before was now compounded by the isolation, the darkness, the absolute helplessness of being trapped and aware for longer than any mortal mind should have to endure. And now the power was returning. The Helbrute systems were coming back online one by one, weapon systems initializing, motor functions testing, the pilot's connection to his metal body strengthening. Soon, perhaps in hours, perhaps in minutes, the Helbrute would be fully functional, and when that happened, it would almost certainly attempt to destroy everything in its immediate vicinity, because that was what Helbrutes did. They killed. It was the only thing left to them. Kethlin turned to Overlord Ahmontek and transmitted his findings. The data package included not just raw information, but the cryptex analysis and recommendations. The Helbrute was dangerous, more than dangerous. It was a contamination, a source of warp corruption that threatened the integrity of the entire tomb. Every moment it remained active risked spreading its taint through the facility. The living metal of the tomb itself was already showing microscopic signs of corruption near the vault. If the Helbrute fully awakened, if it broke free of the weakened containment, the corruption could spread exponentially. There were options, Kethlin suggested. The most obvious was immediate destruction. Obliterate the Helbrute with overwhelming firepower before it could fully awaken. The risk was the possibility of a catastrophic release of warp energy if the sarcophagus was breached too quickly. The contained corruption might explode outward, damaging the tomb and potentially creating a rift to the Imperium. Necron weapons were powerful, but they interacted unpredictably with warp-tainted targets. The second option was renewed containment. Repair and reinforce the seals, place the Helbrute back into proper stasis, maintain the prison that had held it for 5 million years. This was the safest option in some ways, but it left the threat in place. Eventually, inevitably, the seals would fail again, or some other crisis would occur. The Helbrute would remain a hidden danger at the heart of the tomb world, waiting. The third option was the one that interested Kethlin most, though he knew it was also the most dangerous: study and potential weaponization. The Helbrute represented an opportunity to understand chaos technology from the inside. The Necrons had fought enemies of all kinds throughout their long existence, but direct examination of chaos-corrupted machinery was rare. Most such objects were too dangerous to preserve, and the instinct of most Necrons was to destroy tainted materials on sight. But if the Helbrute could be carefully examined, if its systems could be analyzed and understood, perhaps that knowledge could be used. Perhaps the Necrons could develop better countermeasures against chaos corruption. Perhaps they could even find ways to turn chaos technology against the forces of disorder themselves. Amontech considered the options with the calculating precision that had made him a successful overlord for millions of years. He consulted with the other nobles present, particularly the lords who served as his advisors. He queried the cryptechs in attendance for their specialized knowledge. A chronomancer confirmed that time-based containment could be reinforced, though it would require significant resources. A plasmancer suggested that directed energy weapons could safely incinerate the Helbrute if aimed precisely. A psychomancer, specialist in the manipulation of fear and consciousness, offered the disturbing observation that the pilot's consciousness, despite its madness, was still technically present. It might be possible to interface with it, to extract information about the enemies who had created this abomination. The Overlord's decision was made with the weight of millennia behind it, informed by experiences that predated the rise of human civilization. Overlord Amontech had ruled Valdrath Prime for epochs beyond counting. He had fought in the war in heaven. He had personally battled the Old Ones and survived encounters with the Satan. He had commanded legions in battles where entire star systems were the prize. He understood war and danger in ways that younger beings could not comprehend. And he understood something else: the absolute necessity of maintaining the purity of his tomb world against all threats. The warp was anathema to everything the Necrons represented. It was chaos, disorder, entropy, given consciousness, and hunger. The Necrons, who had sacrificed their very souls to escape the ravages of entropy, who had traded flesh for eternal metal to achieve perfect order, could not and would not allow warp corruption to persist in their sacred spaces. This was not negotiable. It was not a matter of debate. It was fundamental to what they were. But Amontech was also pragmatic. He had not survived as long as he had by being inflexible or refusing to adapt to new circumstances. The galaxy had changed immeasurably during the Necrons' long sleep. New enemies had arisen. Old certainties had been overturned. The Necrons were awakening to find themselves one power among many, not the dominant force they had been at the height of their empire. Every advantage, every piece of intelligence, every potential weapon had to be considered carefully. So Amontech made his choice, balancing caution against opportunity, weighing risk against potential reward. The Helbrute would be allowed to awaken fully, but under strictly controlled conditions. The vault would be sealed completely, reinforced with the full power of the tomb's defensive systems. Lichguard would be stationed at every approach. Canoptech constructs would create multiple layers of backup containment. Cryptechs would monitor the warp energies constantly, ready to activate emergency protocols if corruption began to spread beyond acceptable parameters. And Kethlin would observe. The Technomancer would document everything about the Helbrute's awakening, its behavior, its capabilities, its weaknesses. They would learn what they could from this abomination before deciding its ultimate fate. If knowledge could be gained without unacceptable risk, then knowledge should be gained. That was the Cryptech way, and Amontech trusted Kethlin's judgment on such matters. But the moment, the very instant, that the threat became uncontainable, the moment corruption began to spread beyond the vault's boundaries, the Helbrute would be destroyed with absolute prejudice. Amontech gave specific orders to his most trusted warriors. If he gave the signal, they were to obliterate the entire vault section. 30 layers of living metal would be teleported into position, sealing the chamber beyond any hope of escape. Antimatter warheads, kept in secure storage for the most extreme emergencies, would be deployed. The fabric of space-time itself would be temporarily ruptured, creating a localized implosion that would crush the Helbrute to subatomic particles. The risk of corruption would be burned away in energies that made plasma torches look like candle flames. Kethlin acknowledged the order with the calm acceptance of one who had served the dynasty for millions of years. He understood the Overlord's reasoning, agreed with it even, though cryptex rarely admitted to agreeing with nobles as a matter of professional pride. The technomancer positioned himself at an observation point where he could monitor the Helbrute directly while maintaining safe distance. His canoptech constructs spread throughout the vault, ready to react to any threat. Additional forces assembled outside the vault. Full legions of Necron warriors, phalanxes of immortals, Lichguard in defensive formations, even several tomb stalkers recalled from patrol duties in the deeper reaches of the tomb complex. If the Helbrute proved too dangerous, overwhelming force would be applied instantly. But if it could be controlled, studied, potentially understood, then perhaps this ancient abomination could serve a purpose beyond simply being destroyed. The decision was made. Now came the waiting. The Helbrute stirs, and the first sign was not mechanical but psychic. The warp energy signature in the vault suddenly intensified. A spike so pronounced that even the soulless Necrons could detect it through their instruments. The air itself seemed to thicken, though air pressure remained constant according to physical sensors. Colors appeared at the edges of perception, hues that had no names because they should not exist in normal space-time. Shadows moved without light sources. The walls of the vault groaned, despite being constructed from materials that should not respond to mere pressure. Kethlin's instruments recorded a cascade of readings that defied conventional physics. Chronometers near the Helbrute began running at variable speeds, time itself becoming elastic in the presence of so much warp energy. Dimensional detectors showed space-time folding in on itself, creating pockets of non-Euclidean geometry where the normal 3 dimensions were insufficient to describe what was happening. Matter itself became unstable at the quantum level, atomic bonds vibrating in patterns that suggested they wanted to dissolve into pure energy. Inside the Helbrute's sarcophagus, consciousness returned to the pilot designated as Goroth. But consciousness was perhaps too kind a word for what he experienced. It was not the clean awakening from sleep that living beings knew, nor the systematic boot-up of computer systems. It was a dragging, clawing ascent from depths of madness where he had dwelt for so long that sanity seemed like a barely remembered dream from another life entirely. Goroth did not remember much of what he had once been. The centuries of madness had eroded his memories like water wearing away stone. He had been a space marine once, of the Iron Warriors Legion, proud and skilled in the arts of siege warfare and destruction. He had served under war leaders whose names he could no longer recall, fought in battles on worlds whose designations had faded from his damaged mind. He had been wounded, catastrophically wounded, and then came the sarcophagus. The binding, the fusion of flesh and metal that had stolen everything from him, except the capacity to suffer and to hate. How long had he been here? He tried to remember, but could not. Time had no meaning in the darkness of dormancy. He might have been sealed in this vault for days or centuries or epochs. The stasis field that had held him was unlike normal sleep, because even in the deepest sleep, some tiny spark of consciousness persisted. He had been aware, on some level, throughout the imprisonment. Aware, but unable to move, unable to scream, unable to do anything but exist in an eternal now of imprisonment. And he remembered the battle that had brought him here. Flashes of memory, disconnected and chaotic. The Iron Warriors warband deploying to some world. The name was gone, but he remembered it had been important strategically. They had been raiding, or conquering, or perhaps just killing, because that was what Chaos Space Marines did. And then the enemy had appeared. Not Imperial forces, not the weakling Astartes who still served the false emperor. Something else. Something ancient and terrible. The Necrons. He remembered skeleton warriors rising from the ground, their weapons stripping flesh and armor apart molecule by molecule. He remembered the complete cold logic with which they had fought, utterly unlike the passionate fury of chaos or the desperate courage of the Imperium. They had simply advanced, implacable and unstoppable, weathering losses that would have broken any other army because they could not feel fear and did not understand defeat. And they had won. The Iron Warriors had been forced to retreat, taking heavy casualties. Goroth had been damaged by weapons he barely understood, his power systems failing, his consciousness fading as system after system went offline. He had thought that was death, or at least dormancy, until his warband could retrieve and repair him. Instead, he had been taken, captured, imprisoned, sealed away by the Xenos machines in this place of absolute darkness and silence. And for all that time, however long it had been, he had been alone with his madness, his hatred, his rage against the universe that had done this to him. Now power was returning. He could feel his systems coming back online, one by one. Weapons initializing, motor functions testing. The familiar weight of his Helbrute body surrounding him, responding to his will, becoming part of him in the way that only a Helbrute pilot could understand. The sarcophagus that held his ruined flesh pulsed with renewed energy, pumping tainted fluids through his remaining veins, sustaining the horror of his half-life. Goroth's consciousness expanded to fill his Helbrute form. His optical sensors came online, and for the first time in however long he had been imprisoned, he could see. The vision was strange, filtered through mechanical lenses that showed the world in different spectrums than organic eyes. But it was vision, and after the absolute darkness of dormancy, even this limited sight was overwhelming. He saw the vault around him, alien and wrong. Everything was the color of metal and death, surfaces too smooth and perfect, angles that hurt to perceive because they suggested geometries his chaos-warped mind rejected instinctively. And he saw them, the Xenos, the machine skeletons who had imprisoned him. They stood beyond the containment field, watching him with optical sensors that glowed with cold green light. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all staring at him with the same emotionless curiosity that a scientist might show toward a particularly interesting specimen. Rage flooded through Goroth's consciousness. Not the hot rage of organic beings, though he remembered what that felt like. This was colder, deeper, more fundamental. It was the rage of one who had been utterly powerless and now had power returning. It was the rage of endless imprisonment, suddenly offered the possibility of revenge. It was the rage that came from madness so complete that it wrapped back around to something approximating focus. He tried to move, and his Helbrute body responded sluggishly. Systems were still coming online. Power distribution was uneven. Centuries of disuse had left components stiff and reluctant. But movement was possible. He raised one massive arm, the power fist grinding as servos struggled to move limbs that had been still for millions of years. The sound echoed through the vault, like the growl of some ancient beast awakening from hibernation. Kethlin observed this with scientific detachment, his instruments recording every detail. The Helbrute's awakening was following predictable patterns, given what he knew of chaos-corrupted machinery. Motor functions returning before weapon systems, a design choice that suggested the builders wanted to ensure the untold pilot could move before they could kill. Fascinating. The power distribution network was routing energy in ways that defied thermodynamic principles, drawing from the warp to supplement conventional power sources. The fusion of organic and mechanical components was creating feedback loops that should have been catastrophic, but somehow functioned. It was elegant in its wrongness, a masterwork of corrupted engineering. The pilot's consciousness, from what Kethlin could detect, was exactly as predicted, completely insane, but functional enough to operate its body. Rage and hatred radiated from it like heat from a fire. There was no complex thought there, no planning or reasoning, just pure murderous intent focused on everything around it. The pilot wanted to kill, needed to kill, existed only to kill. It was the distilled essence of violence given form and consciousness. The containment field was all that held the Helbrute in place, and Kethlin monitored it carefully. The field was energy-based, a standing wave of power that created a barrier no physical force could cross without tremendous expenditure of energy. But it was not absolute. The warp energy radiating from the Helbrute was degrading it, slowly but measurably. The field would hold, for now. But if the Helbrute continued to power up, if its weapon systems came fully online and began generating their own energy signatures, the calculations were concerning. Goroth tested his constraints, his mad consciousness probing the limits of his prison. He could see the barrier holding him, could sense it, even though it was invisible to normal sight. Energy, power, a cage of force. He pushed against it experimentally and felt it resist. Not impassable, he realized. Strong, but not infinite. If he struck hard enough, if he focused all his power in one place, he might be able to breach it. But not yet. His systems were still initializing. His weapons were not ready. The plasma cannon mounted on his right arm was drawing power, but not yet capable of firing. The power fist on his left arm was functional, but lacked the full force it could generate. He needed time. Time to fully awaken. Time to gather his strength. Then he would break free of this prison and tear apart the Xenos who had dared to imprison him. Amontek watched this awakening with the cold calculation of one who had seen countless threats rise and fall over millions of years. The Helbrute was dangerous, yes, but it was contained, barely functional, and facing overwhelming force. It was a weapon without direction, power without purpose, and as long as it remained in that state, it could be studied, understood, potentially exploited. The Overlord communicated through the noospheric network, issuing precise orders to his forces. Positions were adjusted, additional reserves were brought forward, cryptex prepared countermeasures, devices designed to disrupt warp energy, weapons calibrated to target the Helbrute's specific energy, signature emergency stasis protocols ready to activate if the situation deteriorated. Everything was prepared, everything was controlled. The situation was dangerous but manageable. But Amontek had not survived millions of years by underestimating enemies, and he did not make the mistake of underestimating the Helbrute now. He recognized what he saw before him. Not just a broken war machine, but a manifestation of everything the Necrons opposed. The warp, chaos, organic madness elevated to the level of existential threat. This thing represented the ultimate enemy, the force that had driven the Necrons to sacrifice their very souls in pursuit of perfect order. And now it was waking up in the heart of his tomb world, radiating corruption that threatened to taint the perfect purity of Necron technology with its presence. The decision to study it had been logical, but Amontek was prepared to reverse that decision instantly if necessary. His hand, or the artificial equivalent in his, Necron form, metaphorically rested on a trigger that would obliterate the entire vault section. All he needed was sufficient cause. Inside the sarcophagus, Goroth's consciousness continued to expand and focus. Madness did not mean lack of intelligence. He retained tactical awareness, the ability to assess threats and formulate responses. He studied his captors through optical sensors that gave him far better vision than flesh and blood eyes ever could. The Xenos were arranged in defensive formations, weapons ready, but not aimed directly at him. They were watching, studying, curious about what he would do. That curiosity would be their mistake. Goroth understood the advantage of being underestimated. Let them watch, let them study, let them believe they had him contained and controlled. When his full power returned, when his weapon systems came online and he broke free of this energy cage, they would learn the truth. A Helbrute unleashed was death incarnate. No force in the galaxy could stand against that fury once it was fully aroused. His weapon systems continued their initialization sequence. Power flowing, targeting matrices activating, the blessed gifts of the Chaos Gods suffusing his mechanical body with their dark energies. Soon, very soon. And then these arrogant Xenos would understand exactly what they had imprisoned in their precious tomb. They would understand that some things should be destroyed, not studied. that chaos was not a force to be analyzed and catalogued, but a fundamental power that consumed all who came too close. Goroth began to channel his rage, focusing it the way he had been trained millennia ago when he was still fully human. Anger was power. Hatred was fuel. The chaos gods fed on emotion, and he had emotions in abundance. His madness was not weakness, but strength. The strength of one who had nothing left to lose, who had already paid any price that could be demanded, who existed in a state beyond suffering because suffering was all he had known for so long that it had become his natural state. The containment field flickered, just slightly, just for a microsecond, but it flickered. Kethlin's instruments registered the fluctuation, and his consciousness processed the implications with lightning speed. The warp energy was beginning to overwhelm the barrier. The Helbrute was channeling power in ways that transcended physical laws. This was exactly what the cryptech needed to observe, direct evidence of how chaos corrupted and subverted normal energy systems. But it was also alarming. The containment might fail sooner than calculated. Amontech received the data update and made a decision: reinforcement. Additional power was routed to the containment field, drawing from the tomb's primary reactors. The barrier strengthened, its stability restored. But this was a temporary measure. If the Helbrute continued to power up, even enhanced containment would eventually fail. A choice would have to be made soon: continue observation and risk catastrophic containment failure, or destroy the threat before it could fully manifest. The moment hung suspended, tension building like a storm about to break. The Necrons watched with emotionless precision, recording data and calculating probabilities. The Helbrute continued its awakening, systems coming online, power building, madness focusing into terrible purpose. Two fundamentally opposed forces, perfect order and absolute chaos, stood on the brink of violent collision. And then the clash in the tomb began with a sound that should not have been possible. Goroth screamed. The sound emerged from his Helbrute's Vox speakers, but it was more than mere audio. It was a psychic howl, raw emotion given voice, madness made audible. The sound waves carried warp energy, and where they struck the vault walls, reality briefly fractured. Colors that did not exist flickered into being and vanished. Shadows moved independently of light sources. The air itself seemed to scream in sympathy with the trapped pilot's rage. Kethlin's sensors registered massive spikes in warp energy. The Helbrute was not just awakening, it was channeling power from the Imperium directly, using its pilot's consciousness as a bridge between reality and unreality. This was more than the cryptech had anticipated. This was not simply a corrupted war machine, but an active conduit for chaos energy. The danger had just increased by several orders of magnitude. Before Amontech could give the order to activate emergency destruction protocols, Goroth acted. The Helbrute's power fist suddenly blazed with energy, warp flames wreathing the massive weapon in fire that was not fire. He struck the containment field with all his might, and for a moment, the barrier held. Energy met energy, force met force, order met chaos. The vault was filled with light so bright it overwhelmed optical sensors and sound so loud it resonated through the tomb's structure. The containment field buckled, not shattered, not destroyed, but compromised. A rupture appeared, a tear in the energy barrier just large enough for a massive mechanical fist to push through. Goroth roared again, that terrible psychic scream, and forced himself through the breach. Living metal scraped against energy fields, creating sparks that were both physical and metaphysical. The Helbrute emerged from its containment like some nightmarish birth, pulling itself free through a gap that should not have existed. The Necrons responded with the perfect coordination of a machine intelligence. No panic, no fear, no hesitation, just instant tactical adjustment. Necron warriors at the vault entrance opened fire with their Gauss flares, emerald beams of energy that could strip matter apart at the molecular level. The beams struck the Helbrute's armor, and for a moment it seemed like they would tear through its corrupted chassis as they would any normal target. But the Helbrute was not normal. Where the Gauss energy struck, warp energy rose to meet it. Matter did not strip away cleanly. but instead twisted and reformed. Corruption meeting annihilation in a contest that produced results neither side expected. Some sections of armor vaporized as intended. Other sections seemed to absorb the energy and grow stronger, metal fusing with something that was not quite metal, taking on properties that defied analysis. Goroth charged forward, his Helbrute body moving with a speed that should not have been possible for something so massive. Thousands of years of imprisonment exploded into motion, all that stored rage finding outlet in pure physical violence. He crashed into the Necron warriors with the force of a runaway tank, his power fist swinging in wide arcs that crushed necrodermis bodies and scattered Necron limbs like children's toys. But Necron warriors did not break and run. They could not feel fear, could not comprehend retreat. They simply continued their programming: destroy the enemy, hold the line, serve the dynasty. Those smashed apart by the Helbrute's initial assault began reanimating almost immediately, their advanced repair systems knitting broken bodies back together, teleporting away severely damaged components and replacing them with stored backups. The Fallen rose again, reformed their ranks, and resumed firing with the same emotionless precision. The Helbrute's plasma cannon came online with a whine of building energy. Goroth felt the weapon charging, felt the familiar power that had served him in countless battles. He aimed at the mass of Necron warriors and fired. The plasma bolt erupted from the weapon's barrel in a blaze of superheated matter, a miniature sun given trajectory and purpose. It struck the Necron formation dead center. The explosion was catastrophic. Plasma temperatures high enough to vaporize steel on contact expanded in a sphere of destruction. Necron warriors within the blast radius were instantly reduced to their component atoms. Those at the edges survived, but suffered massive damage. Their necrodermis bodies half melted, systems failing, consciousness flickering. But even this was not enough. Even as warriors fell, more emerged from deeper in the tomb to take their places. And the Fallen were already beginning to resurrect, their backup systems activating, new bodies being fabricated in the tomb's reconstruction chambers. Kethlin observed this exchange with growing concern. The Helbrute's firepower was far greater than anticipated. That plasma weapon could threaten even the tomb's structure itself if fired repeatedly. And the warp energy pervading the Helbrute seemed to be growing stronger, not weaker, as if combat itself fed the corruption. This was the danger of chaos. It thrived on conflict, grew stronger through violence, turned battle into a source of power rather than depletion. Amuntek made his decision. The time for observation was over. This threat had to be eliminated before it could cause irreparable damage. The Overlord's command went out through the nospheric network with absolute authority. Destroy it. Immediately. No restraint. Maximum force. All units were authorized to engage with lethal intent. The response was overwhelming. Necron immortals advanced, their Gauss weapons laying down withering fire. Lichguard moved forward with their hyperphase swords active, the weapons capable of phasing through normal matter to strike at vital components directly. Canoptek wraiths flowed across the floor and walls like liquid metal, their dimensional destabilization matrices ready to tear through the Helbrute structure at the molecular level. The Canoptek spider scuttled forward, its massive bulk imposing, its particle beam weapon charging to full power. Goroth found himself facing not just resistance but actual military force, and even through his madness, some tactical awareness remained. He was outnumbered, surrounded, facing enemies who would not break, would not retreat, would not stop until either he or they were destroyed. For any rational being, this would be cause for tactical withdrawal. For a Helbrute pilot consumed by rage and madness, it was simply more targets. He waded into combat with abandon, his weapons firing in all directions, his power fist crushing anything within reach. A Canoptek wraith phased through a wall and struck at his legs, its destabilization field making solid matter temporarily non-existent. The Helbrute stumbled, servos straining as dimensional forces tried to tear his mechanical limbs apart. But warp energy surged in response, reality and unreality clashing in ways that made no sense to conventional physics. The Wraith was forced back, its exotic technology meeting its match in the fundamental wrongness of chaos. Lychguard reached the Helbrute and attacked with their hyperphase swords, the weapons designed to cut through even the hardest materials by shifting them partially out of phase with normal reality. The swords bit into corrupted armor, and for a moment it seemed like they would penetrate to the vital systems beneath. But then warp flames erupted from the wounds, unholy fire that seemed to burn without consuming, existing in defiance of thermodynamics and conservation of energy. The Lychguard were forced back, their necrodermis bodies scorched by energies that should not exist. But the Necrons had numbers, coordination, and millions of years of tactical experience encoded in their strategic protocols. They adapted to the Helbrute's capabilities with machine precision, shifting tactics to account for the warp-enhanced defenses. Gauss weapons were recalibrated to fire in focused bursts rather than sustained beams, overwhelming local chaos energies through sheer concentration of annihilation. Lychguard struck in coordinated patterns, multiple attacks from different angles simultaneously, forcing the Helbrute to defend against too many threats at once. And Kethlin, watching from his observation position, activated his own weapons. The Technomancer was not primarily a combat unit, but all cryptechs carried advanced technology that could be weaponized when necessary. He activated a chronometric disruption field, targeting the Helbrute's immediate temporal frame. For several seconds, the Helbrute experienced time at a different rate than its surroundings. From its perspective, the Necrons moved with blinding speed, while it seemed trapped in molasses. The effect was brief, but in combat, seconds mattered. Goroth felt the temporal distortion and recognized it for what it was: Xenos trickery, reality manipulation. The kind of thing that had made the Old Ones so dangerous in the ancient wars. His databank still held fragments of memory about. But he was not defenseless against such tricks. Chaos was the enemy of order, and time was merely another form of order. He channeled warp energy, forcing reality to reject the temporal manipulation, and felt time snap back to normal flow. The cost was massive, power systems drained, reserves depleted, but he refused to be trapped that way. The battle raged through the vault and spilled into the corridors beyond. The Helbrute advanced, trying to break through the Necron lines and reach open space where he would have room to maneuver. The Necrons contained him, forming layered defensive positions that forced him to fight through multiple ranks of warriors to advance even a few meters. It was a battle of attrition, the Helbrute's weapons and strength against the Necrons' numbers and resurrection protocols. Amontech observed the battle from his command position, processing data and making tactical adjustments in real time. The Helbrute was powerful, but finite. Its ammunition would deplete, its power reserves would drain, its systems would degrade under sustained fire. All they had to do was maintain pressure until the abomination weakened enough to be overwhelmed. It was a simple equation: sustained damage over time versus rate of self-repair. The Necrons would win. Eventually, unless something unexpected occurred. Something unexpected occurred. Goroth, finding himself increasingly pressed by overwhelming numbers, made a choice that only madness could justify. He overloaded his plasma cannon, deliberately sabotaging the weapon's safety protocols to create a catastrophic energy release. It was effectively suicide. The explosion would certainly destroy him, but it would also annihilate everything in the immediate area, potentially creating a breach in the tomb's structure that would destabilize the entire facility. Kethlin detected the energy buildup and understood the implications instantly. The Helbrute was trying to take the entire vault section with him. The cryptech's mind raced through calculations at speeds that defied human comprehension. The explosion would be contained by the tomb's structure, barely. But the warp energies released would corrupt everything in the blast. Radius. The living metal would be tainted. The dimensional geometry would be warped. Recovery would take centuries, perhaps millennia. This was unacceptable. The technomancer made a decision that went against every protocol he had ever followed. He activated his own teleportation systems and phased directly into melee range with the Helbrute, placing himself between the abomination and the Necron forces. His canoptech cloak spread wide, creating an energy barrier that would channel the imminent explosion away from critical systems. It was not a perfect solution. The blast would still cause tremendous damage, but it would prevent the worst-case scenario of widespread corruption. Goroth saw the Xenos cryptech materialize before him and understood the sacrifice being attempted. Even through madness, he could appreciate the tactical logic, but it changed nothing. He was committed to this path now. The plasma cannon reached critical mass, its containment fields beginning to fail. Power building beyond any safe operating parameters. In seconds, it would detonate with the force of a small nuclear weapon. Then Ahmontek acted. The Overlord's command went out with absolute authority, and the tomb responded with the speed of thought. 30 layers of living metal materialized around the Helbrute, forming a perfect sphere that enclosed both the abomination and Kethlen's position. The sphere began to contract, hydraulic force measured in megatons per square centimeter crushing inward. Simultaneously, the dimensional coordinates of the sphere were being altered, phasing it partially out of normal space-time into a pocket dimension specifically designed for containing catastrophic explosions. The plasma cannon detonated. Energy equivalent to a small star erupted in a space smaller than a combat vehicle. The blast would have vaporized anything organic and melted even advanced alloys. But it was contained within the sphere, the force of the explosion meeting the counterforce of collapsing living metal and dimensional translation. The vault shook. The tomb's structure groaned. Energy readings spiked to levels that threatened to overload instruments. But the containment held. When the sphere dematerialized seconds later, both the Helbrute and Kethlen were gone. The Helbrute had been destroyed, reduced to subatomic particles, and scattered across dimensions where physical form had no meaning. Kethlen had been caught in the edge of the blast. His necrodermis body was severely damaged, chunks of living metal missing or melted, his systems in complete failure. But the cryptech's consciousness core was intact. The essential engrams that made him who he was had survived. He would need extensive repair, potentially centuries in the reconstruction chambers. But he would survive. The fundamental incompatibility between Necrons and Chaos corruption had been demonstrated with absolute clarity. Overlord Ahmontek stood in the ruined vault, surveying the damage. With optical sensors that registered but did not truly feel displeasure or satisfaction. The Helbrute was destroyed. The threat was eliminated. The tomb would require repair, but nothing irreplaceable had been lost. By any objective measure, this was a victory. But the Overlord found himself troubled, if such a term could apply to a being without emotions, by what this encounter had revealed. The galaxy had changed during the Necrons' long sleep, in ways that went beyond new empires rising and old ones falling. There were threats now that did not exist when the Necrons first went into stasis. Chaos had grown stronger, more organized, more dangerous. The warp itself had changed, become more aggressive, more actively hostile to ordered reality. The Helbrute had been one warrior of one warband of one Chaos Space Marine Legion, a single example of a single type of enemy unit, and it had taken significant force to destroy, had caused substantial damage to the tomb, and had very nearly succeeded in a catastrophic self-destruct that would have crippled the facility. If one Helbrute could cause this much trouble, what would happen when tomb worlds began encountering chaos forces in large numbers? What if they faced actual demons, entities of pure warp energy that could not be destroyed through conventional means? What if they confronted Chaos Space Marine warbands led by sorcerers who could manipulate reality itself? The answer troubled Ahmontek because it suggested the Necrons faced a fundamental disadvantage. Their immunity to chaos corruption was a tremendous advantage. They could not be turned, could not be possessed, could not be suborned by demonic whispers or chaos promises. But this immunity came from having no souls, no connection to the warp, no capacity for the emotions and hopes and dreams that defined living beings. And that same immunity made them vulnerable in other ways. They could not fight chaos in the warp itself. Demons existed primarily in the Imperium and only manifested in real space under specific conditions. The Necrons had no way to pursue them into their home dimension, no means of striking at the true source of chaos power. They could only react to chaos incursions, defending against attacks, but unable to launch counteroffensives into enemy territory. And chaos drew power from emotion, from belief, from the psychic energy generated by living beings. The more civilizations that existed, the more living creatures that felt fear and rage and ambition, the stronger chaos became. The Necrons, who had embarked on campaigns to exterminate organic life throughout the galaxy, were inadvertently making the problem worse. Every world they purified of living beings was one less source of anti-chaos resistance, but also one more cause for the survivors to feel despair and hatred, feeding the very powers the Necrons sought to oppose. This was the paradox at the heart of the Necron existence. They had sacrificed everything, their flesh, their souls, their connection to the natural cycle of life and death, in pursuit of perfect order and eternal existence. And they had achieved that goal. They were immortal, unkillable in the long term, capable of returning from destruction again and again. But they had paid a price beyond what they initially understood. They had made themselves immune to one enemy only to become peculiarly vulnerable to another. The warp corrupted. That was its nature. It spread disorder and madness and mutation wherever it touched. And the Necrons, for all their technological superiority, had no truly effective defense against corruption of their technology itself. The living metal that composed their bodies and structures was resilient, but not immune to warp-induced changes. The encounter with the Helbrute had proven that. The vault chamber still showed signs of corruption even after the abomination's destruction. Subtle alterations in the molecular structure, impossible angles, forming in corners, colors that should not exist, flickering at the edges of perception. These changes would have to be cleaned, excised, removed before they could spread. Entire sections of the vault would need to be deconstructed down to their component atoms and rebuilt from uncorrupted materials. The dimensional coordinates of the affected areas would need to be reset to ensure no lingering warp taint persisted in higher dimensional space. It would take time, resources, and expertise. And this was from exposure to just one Helbrute. Imagine if they faced actual demonic incursions, where hundreds or thousands of warp entities manifested simultaneously. Kethlin, despite his severe damage, managed to transmit a final report before being taken to the reconstruction chambers. The cryptech's observations were invaluable. Detailed analysis of how warp energy interacted with Necron technology, measurements of corruption rates, assessment of vulnerability points in the tomb's defensive systems. This knowledge would help prepare for future encounters. But it also confirmed the Overlord's fears. The Necrons were powerful, but they were not invincible. Chaos represented a threat they could not simply overwhelm with superior firepower and perfect tactics. This realization spread through the Necron hierarchy as Achmontek compiled his report and transmitted it to other tomb worlds that had awakened. The encounter with the Helbrute became a case study, shared among overlords and cryptechs across multiple dynasties. Tactical assessments were updated, defensive protocols were modified, contingency plans were developed for dealing with chaos incursions. The Necrons learned, as they had learned from every enemy they had ever faced, how to better counter this particular threat. But learning and adapting could not change the fundamental truth. The Necrons and chaos were antithetical to each other in ways that transcended simple military opposition. The Necrons represented perfect order, every warrior identical, every movement calculated, every decision based on logic and efficiency. Chaos represented perfect disorder, every warrior unique in their corruption, every movement driven by mad impulse, every decision made by entities who existed beyond reason and sanity. The Necrons had achieved immortality through technology, becoming machines that could persist eternally. Chaos offered immortality through devotion to the ruinous powers, becoming demonic entities that could persist eternally. The Necrons sought to restore order to the galaxy, returning it to a state they remembered from before the war in heaven. Chaos sought to corrupt the galaxy, transforming it into an extension of the warp, where physical laws were suggestions and reality was what the gods willed it to be. These two forces could not coexist. They could not compromise. They could not find common ground or negotiate truces. When they met, there could be only conflict, total and absolute, until one side was completely destroyed. And the Necrons, for all their power, had to face the uncomfortable reality that destroying chaos might not even be possible. How do you kill an idea? How do you destroy emotion? How do you annihilate beings that exist beyond death itself? The answer, if there was one, remained elusive. But the Necrons would continue searching for it, because that was what they were designed to do. They were survivors, conquerors, the inheritors of an empire that had once spanned the galaxy. They would not be defeated by chaos or any other threat. They would adapt, evolve, find weaknesses in their enemies, and exploit them with merciless efficiency. This was the Necron way. This was what 60 million years of existence had taught them. There was always a solution, always a strategy, always a way to turn disadvantage into victory. But privately, in the depths of his consciousness where no other Necron could observe, Overlord Amontek acknowledged doubt. The Helbrute encounter had revealed something he had not wanted to see. That the Necrons' great strength was also their great weakness. Their perfection was their vulnerability. Their order was their limitation. They had removed everything messy and unpredictable from their existence, and in doing so, they had removed the very things that might have allowed them to truly oppose chaos on equal terms. Living beings could resist chaos through faith, through willpower, through the strength of their souls. The Necrons had no souls to strengthen. Living beings could fight in the warp through psychic power, manifesting their will as physical force in that realm of thought and emotion. The Necrons had no psychic presence to project. Living beings could turn chaos against itself, using the ruinous power's own nature as a weapon against them. The Necrons could barely comprehend chaos, let alone manipulate it. These thoughts would remain unspoken, buried in private reflection, where they could not undermine morale or create doubt among the ranks. But they would influence decisions going forward. The Necrons would be more cautious when dealing with chaos-related threats, more willing to destroy rather than study, more prepared for worst-case scenarios. The lesson of the Helbrute had been learned, and it was a harsh lesson indeed. Resolution and aftermath came gradually as the tomb world of Valdrath Prime settled into its new state of full wakefulness. The damage from the Helbrute's brief rampage was repaired with methodical precision. Corrupted sections of the vault were deconstructed atom by atom, the materials analyzed for contamination and either purified or destroyed depending on the severity of taint. New living metal was fabricated and integrated into the structure. Dimensional coordinates were recalibrated. Energy matrices were reset. Within months, no physical evidence remained of the encounter, but the psychological impact, if Necrons could be said to have psychology, persisted. The warriors who had fought the Helbrute carried engrams of the experience in their consciousness cores. They had witnessed corruption up close, had felt the wrongness of warp energy pressing against their forms. For most Necron warriors, this meant nothing. Their consciousness was too limited to process such experiences in meaningful ways. But for the higher-ranked Necrons, the Immortals and Lords, and especially the Nobles, the encounter had been educational in ways both valuable and disturbing. Kethlen eventually emerged from the reconstruction chambers. his necrodermis body rebuilt, and his systems fully restored. The process had taken nearly 3 standard years, a long time by organic standards, but barely noticeable to a being who had existed for millions of years. The technomancer immediately requested access to all data from the Helbrute encounter, studying it obsessively with the same dedication he had shown for every scientific mystery throughout his long existence. His report, when finally compiled, ran to thousands of pages of dense technical data and analysis. It became required reading for cryptex throughout the dynasty. The key findings were both encouraging and concerning. Encouraging because the Necrons had proven they could destroy chaos-tainted threats through sufficient application of force. The Helbrute's warp-enhanced defenses, while formidable, were not impenetrable. Coordinated tactical response using overwhelming firepower could overcome even enemies that drew power from the Imperium. This was valuable knowledge. It meant chaos was not invincible, not unstoppable, not beyond the reach of Necron military might, but concerning because the cost of victory had been significant. The damage to the tomb, the resources expended in repair, the near destruction of Kethlin himself, the risk of catastrophic corruption spreading, all of this from a single enemy unit. Chaos forces operated in warbands that numbered in the hundreds or thousands. Major chaos incursions could involve tens of thousands of corrupted warriors supported by daemonic entities and sorcerous powers. If one Helbrute required this level of response, what would be needed to counter a full-scale chaos invasion? The answer suggested the Necrons would need to adapt their standard tactical doctrines when facing chaos enemies. Overwhelming force applied rapidly would be essential. Give chaos no time to entrench, no opportunity to spread corruption, no chance to bring reinforcements from the warp. Containment would be critical. Ensure corrupted areas were isolated and purged before taint could spread to uncontaminated regions. And most importantly, avoid prolonged engagements where chaos could draw strength from the very act of combat itself. These lessons were incorporated into the tactical databases of not just Valdrath Prime, but all awakening tomb worlds in the dynasty. Overlord Achmontek shared his report with other overlords, and they in turn shared it throughout their own domains. The Necron communication network, vast and ancient, carried the information across light years. Within decades, every major tomb world in that sector of the galaxy had updated their protocols for dealing with chaos threats. The specific vault where the Helbrute had been contained was permanently sealed after repairs were completed. Achmontek deemed it too compromised to be used for storage again, too associated with corruption to risk placing other artifacts within it. The chamber was filled with living metal in its dormant state, creating a solid block where the vault had been. Eventually, the tomb's automated systems would reclaim even this metal, recycling it into other components and erasing even the physical location where the encounter had occurred. But the memory would persist. Necrons did not forget. Their perfect recall meant that every detail of the incident remained accessible in their consciousness cores, able to be retrieved and reviewed at any time. The Helbrute's image was stored in countless databanks, its capabilities analyzed in exhaustive detail, its weaknesses catalogued for future exploitation. If the Necrons encountered more Helbrutes, and given the prevalence of chaos in the current galaxy, they almost certainly would, they would be prepared. Achmontek himself spent significant time in reflection following the incident, reviewing his decisions and analyzing alternative strategies. This was standard procedure for Necron nobles. Each battle, each encounter, each decision was subject to rigorous after-action analysis. What could have been done better? What risks were unnecessary? What resources were wasted? The questions were asked with mechanical precision, devoid of the emotional weight that would have accompanied human self-examination, but no less thorough for that lack. The Overlord concluded that the decision to study the Helbrute, rather than destroy it immediately, had been of hers calculated risk that ultimately proved valuable despite the costs. The knowledge gained was worth the price paid, barely. But in future encounters with similar threats, The default response would be immediate destruction, unless extraordinary circumstances justified alternative approaches. The risk of corruption was simply too great to allow extended study of chaos-tainted materials. This conclusion represented a shift in Necron philosophy that would have broader implications across their awakening empire. The Necrons had always prided themselves on their scientific approach, their willingness to study and understand enemies before destroying them. Knowledge was power, and the cryptex in particular championed the preservation and examination of enemy technology. But chaos forced a different calculation. Some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue. Some technologies were too corrupted to safely examine. Some enemies needed to be destroyed without hesitation or study. It was a pragmatic adaptation, but it represented a kind of defeat nonetheless. By acknowledging that some things should not be studied, the Necrons were implicitly admitting that their analytical approach had limits. There were forces in the galaxy that transcended rational understanding, that existed beyond the reach of scientific method, that could not be safely examined and catalogued. This was an uncomfortable realization for beings who had spent millions of years developing technology and knowledge to master the physical universe. But the Necrons were nothing if not adaptable. They had survived 60 million years of sleep, had weathered the destruction of their gods, had persisted through changes that had seen entire civilizations rise and fall. They would adapt to this as they had adapted to everything else. Chaos was dangerous, yes. Chaos was irrational and unpredictable and fundamentally opposed to everything the Necrons represented. But chaos was also just another enemy, and the Necrons had destroyed countless enemies throughout their long existence. This one would be no different in the end. The galaxy continued its endless cycle of war and conflict. Tomb worlds kept awakening. The Necrons emerged from their 60 million year sleep to find a galaxy vastly changed, but still recognizable in its fundamental chaos. Everywhere they looked, younger races fought for dominance: the Imperium, the Orcs, the Tyranids, the Eldar, and countless others. And threaded through all of it, like poison through veins, was chaos. The Necrons would fight them all. They would reclaim their lost empire, restore their ancient glory, and perhaps, though this hope was rarely voiced, find some way to reverse the biotransference and reclaim their stolen souls. It was a long struggle, measured in millennia rather than years. But the Necrons had patience beyond mortal comprehension. They would endure. They would persist. They would win. And if occasionally they encountered threats like the Helbrute, abominations that represented everything they had sacrificed their souls to oppose, they would destroy those threats with the same cold efficiency they applied to all obstacles, because that was what the Necrons were. That was what they had been designed to be: eternal, implacable, unstoppable. The rightful rulers of the galaxy returned from their long sleep to reclaim what was theirs. The encounter with the Helbrute was just one incident in a conflict that would span centuries. But it was an important incident, a lesson learned, a warning heeded. The Necrons had been reminded that they were not invincible, that there were threats in the current galaxy that could challenge even their ancient power. And they had proven, at least to themselves, that they could overcome such threats through proper application of force and tactics. So as Amontek stood in his command chamber, reviewing reports from other tomb worlds and planning campaigns to reclaim additional sectors, he carried with him the memory of the Helbrute. It would inform his future decisions, shape his tactical thinking, and remind him that vigilance was necessary even for immortal beings. The galaxy was more dangerous than the Necrons remembered, but the Necrons were also more capable than their enemies knew. The war continued, the awakening proceeded, and deep in the tomb world of Valdrath Prime, in sealed chambers and hidden vaults, other artifacts from ancient conflicts waited in storage. Perhaps some of them were also beginning to wake, stirred by the tomb's reactivation. Perhaps other threats lurked in the darkness, waiting for their moment to strike. But the Necrons were ready now. They had learned. They had adapted. And whatever came next, they would face it with the same emotionless determination that had carried them through 60 million years and would carry them through 60 million more. The galaxy was theirs. They just needed to take it back. One world at a time. One battle at a time. One enemy at a time. Starting with the strange, corrupted, impossible thing that had invaded their tomb and paid the price for that intrusion. The Helbrute was destroyed. Its corruption was purged. Its threat was eliminated, and the message was sent to anyone who might be listening. The Necrons have returned, and they will tolerate no rivals, no corruption, no disorder in their domain. The tomb world slept again, but not as deeply as before. Some Necrons remained active, maintaining watch, conducting repairs, preparing for the next crisis, because there would always be another crisis. That was the nature of existence in the grim darkness of the far future. There was only war, only conflict, only the eternal struggle between order and chaos, between life and death, between those who would build and those who would destroy. And in that struggle, the Necrons knew their place. They were the ancient ones, the survivors, the inheritors of empire. They had faced the Satan and won. They had fought the old ones and triumphed. They would face chaos and its corrupted servants and overcome them as well. It was not hope that drove them. Hope was an emotion they could no longer feel. It was certainty, cold and mechanical and absolute. They were Necrons. They were eternal. They were inevitable. And nothing, not Helbrutes, not Chaos Space Marines, not demons, not even the ruinous powers themselves, would stand in their way. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the grim darkness of Warhammer 40,000 and want to see more content like this, exploring the rich lore of this incredible universe, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Stories of Hammer. Your support helps us continue bringing you these immersive journeys into the 41st millennium and beyond. Thank you for watching, and until next time, the Emperor protects.